For 25 years, the waters of Maple Creek kept their secret. In 1989, a Muslim woman vanished from a quiet Illinois town where faith was supposed to protect the innocent. Her car was found abandoned by the water's edge. No body, no answers, just prayers and silence. But when drought finally exposed what the creek had hidden, investigators discovered something that would shatter a community's trust forever. Sometimes the most dangerous predators hide behind the collar. Sometimes the truth drowns deeper than any river. And sometimes even God's servants forget they're being watched. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The autumn sun filters through stained glass windows of St. Matthew's Church, casting colored shadows across worn wooden pews. September 1989. Mapleton, Illinois, breathes with the rhythm of a small town where everyone knows their neighbor's prayers. Aisha Rahman steps carefully through the front door of her new home, Omar's gentle hand guiding boxes from their car. The modest two-story house sits 3 blocks from the church steeple that rises above every roofline in town. She adjusts her headscarf against the crisp air, watching children play in yards where American flags hang beside autumn wreaths. "It's quiet here," she tells Omar, unpacking dishes from newspaper. "Different from Chicago." "Good different," Omar replies, setting books on empty shelves. His engineer's precision shows in how he arranges their few belongings. "You'll find your place." 2 days later, Aisha walks through the doors of New Hope Women's Shelter. The converted Victorian house smells of coffee and fresh paint. Sister Margaret, the volunteer coordinator, greets her with weathered hands and genuine warmth. "We serve women from all walks of life," Sister Margaret explains, showing Aisha the intake room, the kitchen, the small chapel in back. Father Brooks from St. Matthew's helps with donations. Good man, been supporting us for years. That afternoon, Father Daniel Brooks arrives carrying boxes of canned goods. At 42, he commands respect through presence alone, tall, silver-touched hair, eyes that seem to hold the weight of confessions. When Sister Margaret introduces him to Aisha, his handshake lingers a moment too long. "Mrs. Rahman," he says, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of Sunday sermons. "Welcome to our community. It's rare to find someone so dedicated to service." Aisha smiles politely. "My faith teaches that helping others brings us closer to God." Something flickers across Brooks' expression, recognition perhaps, or something deeper. Yes, faith bridges many gaps. As weeks pass, the priest's visits to the shelter increase. He arrives with supplies, stays for conversations that stretch beyond necessity. Aisha appreciates his interest in her background, his questions about Islamic teachings, his apparent respect for her dedication. "In my culture," she tells him one October afternoon while sorting donations, "we believe charity is one of our highest duties. It purifies the soul." Brooks nods, arranging canned goods with unnecessary precision. The Bible speaks similarly of love through action. Perhaps our faiths aren't so different, but something in his tone troubles her. His questions grow more personal. How does she find peace in a Christian community? Does her husband understand her calling? Has she ever felt conflicted about her path? "Father," she says gently, "I think service itself is the answer to any conflict." He studies her face with an intensity that makes her shift uncomfortably. "You have unusual wisdom for someone so young." That evening, Brooks sits alone in his rectory office, staring at the telephone. He lifts it twice, sets it down twice. Finally, he opens his desk drawer and pulls out a leather journal, the kind used for spiritual reflection. His pen hovers over the blank page. October 15, 1989. "God tests us in ways we cannot predict." She speaks of purification, and I find myself in need of exactly that. How does one cleanse desire that feels sacred and sinful at once? Sunday morning arrives with crisp air and the sound of church bells echoing across Mapleton. Brooks stands at his pulpit, looking out over familiar faces. The Johnsons in the front row, the elderly widow Mrs. Patterson, families with children fidgeting in starched clothes. His sermon, planned days ago, seems suddenly irrelevant. "Today I want to speak about temptation," he begins, his voice carrying unusual weight. "Not the obvious temptations we recognize and resist, but the ones that come disguised as virtue, the ones that whisper to us in the language of love." Parishioners shift in their seats. Mrs. Patterson raises an eyebrow. "Scripture tells us that even Christ was tempted in the wilderness. But what if the wilderness is not a desert, but a place of beauty? What if temptation comes not from evil, but from good itself twisted into wrong?" Brooks grips the pulpit edge, his knuckles white, sweat beads on his forehead despite the cool morning. "Love is patient. Love is kind, but what happens when love becomes impatient, when kindness becomes need, when the shepherd finds himself drawn to one lamb above all others? The congregation exchanges confused glances. This is not the Father Brooks they know, the man of measured words and comfortable certainties. We must pray, he concludes abruptly, for strength to resist not just evil, but the good that would lead us astray. The closing hymn feels strained. As families file out, they whisper among themselves. Something has changed in their priest, though none can name exactly what. The first letter arrives on a Tuesday evening in late October. Aisha finds it slipped under her front door. No stamp, no return address, just her name written in careful script. Inside, elegant handwriting quotes scripture. Love is patient. Love is kind, but my soul cannot wait for autumn to become spring. She reads it twice, then shows it to Omar over dinner. Probably some lonely person from town, Omar suggests, cutting his pot roast with practical efficiency. Maybe someone who appreciates your work at the shelter. But the handwriting is so formal, almost ecclesiastical. Ecclesiastical? Aisha traces the flowing letters with her finger, like someone who copies scripture often. The second letter comes 3 days later. This one is longer, more intimate. Your faith shines like a light in my shadow. I find myself praying for guidance, but my prayers have become confessions. Forgive me for watching from afar. Forgive me for these words I cannot speak aloud. Fear creeps into Aisha's voice when she calls her witness, a nurse at the local hospital. Should I tell Omar? Maybe it's just someone with a crush, the witness suggests. Harmless, but Aisha cannot shake the feeling that something deeper lurks behind the careful words. That night, she checks the door, locks twice, and pulls the curtains closed. On Saturday, she stays late at the shelter to finish intake paperwork for 3 new residents. Rain patters against windows as she locks the building at 8:30 p.m. The parking lot stands empty except for her car and one streetlight casting yellow circles on wet asphalt. As she unlocks her car door, movement catches her peripheral vision. A figure stands beneath the oak tree beside the shelter, tall, wearing what appears to be a dark coat or robe. When she looks directly, the figure doesn't move. "Hello," she calls, her voice carrying across the empty lot. No response. The figure seems to watch her from the shadows. Aisha hurries into her car, locks the doors, and drives home with trembling hands. In her rearview mirror, the oak tree stands empty. The next morning, she mentions the incident to Sister Margaret. "I'll check with Father Brooks," Sister Margaret says. "He sometimes stops by late to drop off supplies." Might have been him. But when Sister Margaret asks, Brooks furrows his brow with apparent concern. "I was home all evening Saturday. Are you certain someone was there?" Aisha seemed quite shaken. "Perhaps we should install better lighting. A woman shouldn't feel unsafe serving God's work." That Sunday, Brooks' sermon focuses on protection and providence. Sometimes, he says, God sends guardians we don't recognize. Sometimes the shadow that seems frightening is actually shelter from greater storms. Aisha sits in the back row, having accepted Sister Margaret's invitation to observe the service. When Brooks' eyes find hers across the congregation, something passes between them: recognition, question, a moment that lasts too long. After the service, he approaches her in the narthex. "Mrs. Rahman, I hope you're settling in well. Sister Margaret mentioned you had a concerning experience. Just a misunderstanding, I'm sure. Still, if you ever feel unsafe, please don't hesitate to call the rectory. Sometimes the protector watching from a distance can better serve if the one being protected knows they're not alone." The phrase echoes in Aisha's mind as she drives home. The protector, watching from a distance. Something about his word choice, his careful emphasis, sends unease crawling up her spine. November brings the first frost and a surveillance tape that changes everything. Sister Margaret discovers it while reviewing the shelter's new security system. The grainy black and white footage shows a figure in long robes standing near the oak tree on the night Aisha saw someone watching. The timestamp reads 8:47 p.m. exactly when Aisha was locking up. Sister Margaret calls the police. Officer Jenkins, a soft-spoken man nearing retirement, reviews the tape at the station. "Hard to make out details," he admits, adjusting his glasses. "Could be anyone in a long coat or religious robes." "You think it could be Father Brooks?" Officer Jenkins shifts uncomfortably. "Sister, Father Brooks has served this community for 15 years. He's counseled half the marriages in town, baptized most of the children. Why would he lurk in parking lots?" "I'm not accusing, I'm asking." When Officer Jenkins shows the tape to Brooks, the priest studies it with careful attention. The figure does appear to be wearing clerical robes. Brooks agrees. "How disturbing. Have you considered that another denomination might be operating in the area? Sometimes zealots from fringe groups target mainstream congregations. You think this is religious harassment? I think Mrs. Rahman's presence might have attracted unwanted attention. A Muslim woman working with a Christian organization, some small minds might find that objectionable. Officer Jenkins nods, making notes. The explanation feels reasonable, even responsible. That evening, Brooks sits in his rectory study, blinds drawn against the November darkness. His journal lies open on the desk, pages filled with increasingly frantic handwriting. November 12, 1989. They have eyes everywhere now, cameras watching the watcher. But how can I explain that my presence near her brings me closer to God? That watching her work, seeing her compassion, fills a void that prayer alone cannot touch? I am not stalking, I am seeking. There is a difference, though the world may not understand it. She is light where I have found only shadow. If that is sin, then I am willing to be a sinner. The next Sunday, his sermon takes a sharp turn toward martyrdom and misunderstanding. Christ himself was accused of improper associations, Brooks tells his congregation. He was questioned for speaking with the Samaritan woman, for allowing Mary Magdalene to anoint his feet. Sometimes love appears as scandal to those who cannot see the divine purpose behind human action. Mrs. Patterson whispers to her neighbor. He's been strange since that Muslim girl started working at the shelter. Her neighbor whispers back, maybe she's having some kind of influence on him. The whispers spread like ripples in still water. By Wednesday, 3 parishioners have called the rectory expressing concern about their priest's unusual themes. By Friday, Father Brooks receives a call from Bishop Morrison. Daniel, I've had some calls. Nothing serious, but people are noticing changes in your sermons. Are you feeling all right? I'm exploring themes of love and acceptance, Bishop. Surely that aligns with our calling. Of course. Just remember that sometimes the appearance of impropriety can be as damaging as impropriety itself. Be careful how your pastoral care might be perceived. Brooks hangs up the phone with shaking hands. Even the bishop has heard whispers. December arrives with the kind of cold that makes breath visible and car engines reluctant. Aisha works longer hours at the shelter as more women seek refuge from both winter and troubled homes. Her shifts often extend past sunset, and she's grown comfortable with the routine of late-night lockups. December 3rd feels no different from any other winter evening. Aisha finishes the day's intake interviews, updates 3 case files, and reviews donation schedules for the upcoming week. The shelter's old radiators click and hiss as heat circulates through Victorian pipes. At 9:12 p.m., she turns off the last light, sets the alarm, and locks the front door. The parking lot spreads empty and silver under streetlights, her small sedan the only car remaining. Frost already glitters on windshields and bare tree branches. She drives the familiar route home down Maple Street, past the elementary school, left on Elm, right on Birch. The radio plays softly, Christmas carols mixed with weather reports predicting the season's first snow. But Aisha Rahman never reaches home. By 6:30 a.m., Omar calls the police. Her car sits abandoned beside Maple Creek, driver's door standing open, keys dangling from the plan. Ignition. Her purse remains on the passenger seat, wallet intact. No signs of struggle inside the vehicle. Officer Jenkins arrives as the sun climbs through bare branches, casting long shadows across the creek bank. Footprints in the frost-hard earth lead from the car toward the water 2 sets, one clearly smaller than the other. Looks like she wasn't alone. Officer Jenkins tells Omar, who stands beside the car with the stunned expression of a man watching his world collapse. The detective arrives from the county seat to take over the investigation. A 20-year veteran with sharp eyes and little patience for small-town assumptions, she surveys the scene with practiced efficiency. Water's only 3 feet deep here, she tells Officer Jenkins. If she went in, accidentally or otherwise, we should find evidence quickly. They don't. Divers search Maple Creek from the bridge to the lake outlet. Volunteers with dogs walk every trail. Search helicopters circle overhead while television crews arrive from Springfield and Chicago. The story of a missing Muslim woman in Christian Mapleton draws attention from civil rights groups and religious organizations alike. Father Brooks leads the search efforts, organizing prayer vigils and volunteer schedules. His voice carries across the community center where families gather to coordinate efforts. Aisha Rahman came to us as a stranger and became our sister, he tells the crowd. We will not rest until she comes home. But as days pass without discovery, hope transforms into something harder to bear. The detective interviews everyone who knew Aisha, shelter workers, grocery store clerks, neighbors who waved from their porches, The picture that emerges is of a woman without enemies, someone whose kindness touched everyone she met. No one disliked her, the detective reports to her supervisor. No domestic issues, no financial problems, no history of depression or risk-taking behavior. She just vanished. The terms Talon's 5 Livenen and the Lost Day by Avram. Memorial service takes place on a gray December morning when snow threatens but doesn't fall. Street. Matthew's church fills beyond capacity. Aisha's Muslim community travels from Chicago, joined by Catholics, Protestants, and those who claim no faith but knew kindness when they saw it. Father Brooks stands at the pulpit where he's delivered thousands of sermons, but today his voice trembles with emotion that seems almost too raw for public consumption. We gather not to say goodbye, but to honor a life that touched our community in ways we're only beginning to understand. He begins, Aisha Rahman came to us across the bridge of faith, showing us that service to others transcends the boundaries we build around belief. He pauses, gripping the pulpit edge as he did during his sermon about temptation months ago. Several parishioners noticed the similarity. In Islamic tradition, water is a symbol of purification. In our Christian faith, we believe in baptism by water, in cleansing and tenten, renewal. Perhaps the waters that have taken her were meant to cleanse her of this world's troubles, to prepare her for a peace we cannot yet understand. The phrase strikes many as oddly specific. Why assume water took her? Why speak of cleansing when no one knows what happened? Omar sits in the front row, his face a mask of contained grief. When Brooks concludes with a prayer that the waters cleanse her spirit and bring her rest, Omar's hands clench in his lap. After the service, mourners gather in the church hall for coffee and shared memories. The detective moves through the crowd, listening to conversations, watching reactions. She notices how Father Brooks positions himself near every group that discusses Aisha's disappearance, how his responses seem carefully prepared. Father, you mentioned water several times in your sermon, the detective says when she finds a moment alone with him. Any particular reason? Brooks adjusts his collar, a nervous gesture she files, away for future reference. Her car was found by the creek. It seemed appropriate to acknowledge that reality. But we haven't found her in the water. No, and we pray we never will. Something in his phrasing bothers her, though she can't immediately identify what. Later, reviewing her notes, she circles the phrase, we pray we never will. Most people would say, we hope we never will, or pray we find her alive. His choice of words suggests an assumption about Aisha's fate that goes beyond available evidence. 2 weeks later, Omar packs his belongings into a U-Haul truck. He cannot bear to remain in Mapleton, surrounded by memories and unanswered questions. Before leaving, he stops at the detective's office. Promise me something, he says, his voice hollow with exhaustion. Don't let them forget her. Don't let this become just another cold case file. The detective promises, though she knows how these things usually end. Time erases everything that justice doesn't resolve. As Omar's truck disappears down Highway 54, snow finally begins to fall. By morning, it covers Maple Creek in pristine white, sealing whatever secrets lie beneath winter's blanket. Years pass like pages turning in a book no one wants to finish. The New Hope Women's Shelter installs new security systems and changes its volunteer procedures, but Aisha's absence echoes through empty spaces where her voice once offered comfort. Sister Margaret retires in 1995, taking with her the last daily reminder of the woman who vanished. The detective moves to the state police, then eventually to a private security firm. Officer Jenkins retires to a cabin near Lake Springfield, still carrying the weight of an unsolved case. The investigation file gathers dust in storage, pulled occasionally when similar cases arise or when new detectives arrive eager to solve old mysteries. Mapleton adapts the way small towns do slowly, collectively forgetting what once seemed impossible to forget. Children who were toddlers when Aisha disappeared graduate high school without ever hearing her name. New families move into houses where longtime residents once gathered to search for a missing neighbor. Father Brooks continues his ministry with quiet dedication, though parishioners notice he rarely mentions interfaith cooperation anymore. His sermons return to familiar themes, sin and redemption, forgiveness and grace delivered in the measured tone they remember from before. The strange period of emotional intensity fades into town memory as that difficult time after the tragedy. In 1992, Brooks receives a new assignment to St. Mark's Parish in Centralia, 40 miles south. Bishop Morrison calls it an opportunity for fresh ministry, though everyone understands the subtext. Even priests need new beginnings sometimes. At Street Marks, Brooks builds a reputation for compassionate counseling and devoted service. He ministers to farm families struggling with economic hardship, visits the sick, performs weddings for young couples full of hope. For 15 years, he seems to have found the peace that eluded him in Mapleton. But in 2005, a parishioner named Janet Caldwell approaches Bishop Morrison with concerns. Father Brooks, she says, has been spending unusual amounts of time with her teenage daughter, Michelle. Not inappropriate time necessarily, but intense conversations about faith and calling that seem to go beyond normal pastoral care. He asks very personal questions about her spiritual struggles. Janet tells the bishop, and he's written her several letters about finding God's purpose in suffering. She's 17 years old. Why would he focus so much attention on one young woman? The bishop meets with Brooks privately. No accusations are made, no formal complaints filed, but Brooks receives counseling about maintaining appropriate boundaries. The incident passes without scandal, though Janet Caldwell transfers her family to another parish. 2 years later, Father Daniel Brooks dies of heart failure in his rectory office, found by his housekeeper clutching his rosary beads. He's 60 years old, carrying whatever secrets live behind his careful sermons to a grave marked only with his name and the dates that bracketed his service. The diocese prepares his office for the incoming priest, Father Martinez, a young man fresh from seminary with modern ideas about transparency and community engagement. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, supervises the packing of Brooks's personal effects, theological books, family photographs, a few items of sentimental value. Strange, Mrs. Chen tells Father Martinez as they work. Father Brooks was always very organized, but this office has areas that seem deliberately hidden. She points to a space behind the large wooden crucifix that hangs opposite his desk. The wall shows scratches and wear marks, as if something heavy had been moved repeatedly. Father Martinez examines the wall with curiosity rather than suspicion. The scratches could be from furniture rearrangement, picture hanging, any number of innocent activities. But when he moves the crucifix to clean behind it, his fingers find an irregularity in the wood, paneling a section that gives slightly under pressure. Mrs. Chen, do you have a screwdriver? The loose panel reveals a hollow space containing a small wooden chest, unmarked and secured with a simple brass lock. Father Martinez weighs it in his hands, feeling objects shift inside. Should we open it? Mrs. Chen asks. I think we should call the bishop first. Bishop Morrison arrives within 2 hours, accompanied by church representative. The chest sits on Brooks' former desk like evidence in a trial that hasn't yet begun. There could be personal papers, Bishop Morrison suggests, family documents, private devotional materials, or, the church representative adds with lawyer's caution, something that requires careful handling. They open the chest with wire cutters borrowed from the church maintenance closet. Inside, wrapped in white cloth, they find a silver bracelet engraved A.R., 5 handwritten letters signed Aisha, a leather journal filled with Brooks' handwriting, 12 photographs of the New Hope Women's Shelter, a newspaper clipping about the missing woman. The silence stretches like a held breath until Bishop Morrison speaks. God help us all. The church representative examines the evidence with professional detachment. The letters appear innocent thank you notes for Brooks' donations to the shelter, updates on the center's activities, one invitation to a multi-faith community service. But when read in sequence, they reveal increasing familiarity, shared conversations about theology and service. The journal tells a different story. September 25, 1989, met her today. Light where I expected shadow. She speaks of faith with such clarity, such purity. I find myself thinking of her during evening prayers. October 2, 1989. Visited the shelter again. Unnecessary, perhaps, but her presence brings me closer to understanding God's design. She asks thoughtful questions about Christian charity. I ask equally thoughtful questions about her dedication. We are teaching each other. October 18, 1989, wrote her a letter today. Anonymous, of course. Some communications require indiscretion. She is married. I am bound by vows. But surely the exchange of spiritual insights transcends earthly limitations. November 5, 1989. They installed cameras at the shelter, as if watching over her were somehow wrong, as if concern were sin. I am her pastor, even if she doesn't realize it yet. Pastors watch their flocks. November 28, 1989. She grows more beautiful each day. Not physical beauty, though that exists, but spiritual radiance. I find myself imagining conversations we might have about God's plan for both of us, if circumstances were different. December 3, 1989. Tonight I tried to baptize my desire, but it drowned me instead. God forgive me for what I have become. God forgive her for what she made me see in myself. The journal entry for December 4th is blank, as are all subsequent pages. Bishop Morrison closes the journal with trembling fingers. We need to call the police immediately. Bishop, the church representative interrupts. Before we do anything irreversible, we should consider the implications. Father Brooks is dead. This investigation ended 18 years ago. Opening this now will what? Protect the church from scandal while that woman's family still doesn't know what happened to her? The argument that follows lasts 3 hours and involves phone calls to diocesan leadership, legal consultants, and church hierarchy. In the end, conscience defeats caution. The detective arrives at St. Mark's Parish with 2 evidence technicians and a growing sense that her department is about to reopen its most notorious cold case. The evidence recovery takes 6 hours. The detective documents each item with careful precision, photographing the hidden compartment, fingerprinting the chest, cataloging contents according to chain of custody protocols that didn't exist when Aisha Rahman first disappeared. The handwriting analysis takes 3 weeks. State forensics expert compares Brooks's journal entries to church records, parish newsletters, and personal correspondence found in his official papers. No question, the expert tells the detective during their meeting at the state crime lab. Same hand wrote the journal, and these anonymous letters found in Aisha Rahman's possessions back in 1989. Distinctive letter formations, pressure patterns, ink flow. Father Brooks was definitely her secret correspondent. The detective reviews the original case file, now digitized and cross-referenced with modern investigative databases. The picture that emerges shows missed connections, overlooked evidence, assumptions that guided the investigation away from its most obvious suspect. He was questioned twice, she tells her partner as they sit in the cramped break room of the county sheriff's office. Both times he provided alibis that were never thoroughly checked. Church meetings, evening prayers, administrative work, all unsupervised activities that could have provided cover. You think small-town politics protected him? I think small-town politics couldn't imagine him needing protection. The discovery reignites public interest immediately. Local television stations lead with the story of new evidence in the Rahman case. Chicago newspapers pick up the coverage, framing it as a tale of religious authority and missing accountability. Social media amplifies every detail, with hashtags like #Justice for Aisha and #Church Secrets trending across platforms. Omar Rahman, now 52 and working as a consulting engineer in Presses, Chicago, receives a phone call from the detective on a Tuesday morning in February. "Mr. Rahman, I wanted you to hear this from us before it hits the news. We've discovered new evidence in your wife's case." Omar sits in his downtown office, watching snow fall past his window, as the detective explains about the hidden chest, the journal, the handwriting match. When she finishes, silence fills the line for nearly a minute. 18 years. Omar finally says, "She's been gone 18 years, and now you tell me her killer was leading her memorial service?" "We don't have enough evidence yet to prove he killed her, but we can place him at the scene of her disappearance, and we can establish motive and opportunity." What happens now? We reopen the investigation. We examine every aspect of Father Brooks' life and behavior around the time of your wife's disappearance. We interview anyone still alive who might have information. And we don't stop until we know exactly what happened. But even as the detective makes that promise, she knows the limitations they face. Brooks is dead. Most physical evidence has been compromised by time and weather. Witnesses have aged, moved away, forgotten crucial details. The case may be reopened, but solving it will require either remarkable luck or a discovery that fundamentally changes their understanding of the evidence. They get their discovery 6 months later. The summer of 2014 brings the worst drought in Illinois history. Maple Creek drops to levels not seen since record-keeping began. Farmers watch corn wither in fields. Municipalities implement water restrictions. Lake levels fall so dramatically that boat ramps sit high and dry, surrounded by cracked mud and exposed lake bed. On July 23rd, a 12-year-old boy named Kevin Patterson walks along the dramatically receded creek bank, hunting for arrowheads and interesting rocks. Near the old stone bridge where Aisha's car was found, something metallic catches the afternoon sun. Kevin pulls a rusted car door from the mud, an old sedan door with glass still intact, covered in algae and 25 years of sediment. Excited by his discovery, he calls his grandfather, who calls the sheriff's office. The detective arrives within an hour, bringing the same sense of anticipation she felt when the journal was first discovered. The car door lies half buried in creek sediment that's been underwater since before Kevin Patterson was born. The detective photographs it from every angle before allowing the recovery team to extract it fully. The metal has corroded badly, but the door frame remains intact, and something else protrudes from the mud nearby, something white and curved. Detective calls the evidence technician. You need to see this. The white object is bone, a human skull, partially buried in silt that once formed the creek bottom. As the recovery team carefully excavates the surrounding area, more bones emerge, ribs, arm bones, the DOST, distinctive curve of a pelvis. And wound around the skeletal remains, almost perfectly preserved in the oxygen-free mud, are Catholic rosary beads. The doctor arrives as the sun sets over the crime scene. She's worked dozens of drowning cases, but this recovery feels different, more deliberate, more ceremonial. Preliminary observations suggest these remains have been here for quite some time, she tells the detective as they watch technicians work under portable floodlights. 20 years or more, based on the degree of decomposition in sediment layers. Could they be Aisha Rahman? We'll know for certain once we run DNA comparison, but the size and bone structure are consistent with a woman in her 20s or 30s. I should have results within a week. The DNA confirmation comes back faster than expected, a perfect match to samples taken from Aisha's personal effects in 1989. But the doctor's autopsy report contains information that fundamentally changes the investigation's direction. Cause of death was strangulation, the doctor explains to the detective and district attorney during their meeting at the morgue. Hyoid bone shows clear fracture patterns consistent with manual strangulation. The victim did not drown. Then how did she end up in the creek? Based on the position of the remains and the way the rosary beads were arranged, I believe the body was placed in the water after death, almost ceremonially. The beads were wound around the torso in a pattern that suggests deliberate arrangement, not accidental entanglement. The district attorney leans forward in her chair. You're saying someone killed her, then performed some kind of ritual before disposal? I'm saying the evidence suggests careful placement rather than hasty concealment. Someone took time with her body. The revelation transforms the case from mysterious disappearance to confirmed homicide. But more importantly, it establishes a timeline that contradicts the original assumption. Aisha Rahman did not accidentally drown or suffer some unknown mishap by the creek. She was murdered by someone who then took time to arrange her body in a specific way before submerging it. The detective returns to Brooks's journal with new understanding. The December 3rd entry, "Tonight I tried to baptize my desire, but it drowned me instead," suddenly reads like confession rather than metaphor. He baptized her, the detective tells her partner. He killed her and then performed some twisted version of a baptism ritual before putting her body in the creek. Can we prove it? We can try. The investigation shifts into high gear. The detective requests Brooks's financial records from the period around Aisha's disappearance. She interviews every surviving member of St. Matthew's Parish who knew the priest during the 1980s. Church administrative files undergo forensic accounting to track any unusual expenditures or schedule changes around December 3, 1989. The pattern that emerges confirms what the physical evidence suggests. Brooks had no verifiable alibi for the evening of December 3rd. His church calendar shows no scheduled meetings or activities. His financial records reveal a cash withdrawal of $200 on December 2nd, significant money for a priest in 1989, with no documented purpose. Most telling, parish maintenance logs show that Brooks requested access to the church basement storage area on December 4th, claiming he needed to retrieve Christmas decorations. The basement connects to a tunnel system built in the 1920s that emerges near Maple Creek. The detective's investigation uncovers a web of institutional protection that spans decades. Church personnel files, obtained through court order, reveal a pattern of behavior that began long before Aisha Rahman entered Brooks's life. In 1987, 2 years before meeting Aisha, Brooks received written counseling for inappropriate personal interest in a female parishioner. The woman, now living in California, agrees to a phone interview with detectives. He started showing up at my workplace, she tells the detective, not doing anything wrong, exactly, but always having reasons to be there. Deliveries for the church, visits to nearby businesses, coincidences that happen too often to be coincidental. Did you report this to church authorities? I mentioned it to the bishop, said I was uncomfortable. Next thing I knew, Father Brooks was getting counseling, and I was asked to consider how my behavior might have been misinterpreted. The pattern repeats in 3 other cases between 1985 and 1989. Each time, women report feeling watched, receiving unwanted attention, finding Father Brooks in places where his presence seemed coincidental but suspicious. Each time, the church responds with quiet counseling for Brooks and subtle pressure on the women to reconsider their concerns. They protected him, the detective tells the district attorney during their strategy meeting. Every warning sign was there, and they chose institutional reputation over public safety. Can we prove the church knew he was dangerous? We can prove they knew he was problematic. The step from problematic to dangerous is the one they chose not to investigate. The district attorney reviews the accumulated evidence: Brooks' journal, confessing obsession, the handwriting match to anonymous letters, the lack of alibi for December 3rd, the tunnel access to Maple Creek, the pattern of inappropriate behavior with other women, and the church's repeated failure to take meaningful action. We have enough for charges, she decides. Posthumous charges for the historical record. The announcement comes on a gray February morning, 25 years after Aisha Rahman disappeared. The district attorney stands before a packed courthouse, reading from prepared remarks that will reshape how Mapleton remembers both its tragedy and its complicity. Based on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and documentary proof, this office is filing posthumous charges of first-degree murder against Father Daniel Brooks in the death of Aisha Rahman. While Mr. Posthumous Char, Brooks cannot face trial due to his death in 2007. The evidence demands acknowledgement of what occurred in December 1989. She pauses, looking directly at the television cameras that will carry this moment to news outlets across the country. Evidence shows that Mrs. Rahman was murdered by strangulation on the evening of December 3, 1989. Her body was then transported to Maple Creek, where it was placed underwater in what appears to have been a ritualistic manner. Father Brooks's own journal entries, handwriting analysis, and circumstantial evidence establish him as the perpetrator of this crime. The courthouse erupts. Reporters shout questions. In the gallery, Omar Rahman sits, with quiet dignity, finally hearing official confirmation of what he suspected for 25 years. The posthumous charges create a legal precedent that reverberates beyond Mapleton. News organizations frame the case as emblematic of institutional failure and delayed justice. Religious scholars debate the intersection of faith and accountability. Legal experts analyze the ethics of charging the dead. But for the people who lived through Aisha's disappearance, the announcement brings a complex mixture of vindication and grief. The truth they've waited 25 years to hear comes wrapped in the bitter recognition that justice delayed can never fully become justice served. The judge who oversees the public hearing speaks with measured authority about the case's broader implications. This proceeding serves not to punish the deceased, but to establish historical truth and acknowledge institutional failure, the judge states during opening remarks. The evidence presented here will be to create a permanent legal record of what occurred in December 1989 and why it remained hidden for so long. The prosecutor methodically presents the case that will never go to trial. Brooks' journal entries are read aloud, each confession hanging in the courtroom air like physical weight. Handwriting analysis is explained in detail. The doctor's autopsy findings are presented with clinical precision that somehow makes the horror more real rather than less. Father Brooks wrote in his journal that he tried to baptize his desire, but it drowned him instead. The prosecutor tells the packed courtroom. The evidence suggests he then attempted to literally baptize his victim, arranging her body in Maple Creek with Catholic rosary beads in what can only be described as a grotesque parody of religious ritual. The church representative, forced to testify under subpoena, acknowledges what internal documents make undeniable. The diocese received multiple reports of Skiller concerning behavior from Father Brooks between 1985 and 1989, she admits, her voice barely audible. With the benefit of hindsight, we recognize that our response was inadequate. Inadequate how? We focused on counseling Father Brooks rather than investigating the validity of the complaints. We prioritized his rehabilitation over the safety of the women who reported concerning behavior, and if those complaints had been properly investigated, the church representative pauses, understanding that her next words will be quoted in every news report. It's possible that Mrs. Rahman's death could have been prevented. The courtroom falls silent. Omar Rahman sits in the front row, tears streaming down his face, not tears of sadness now, but of vindication. Someone in authority has finally acknowledged what he's known for 25 years. His wife died because people in power chose silence over safety. Omar takes the witness stand on the hearing's second day. At 57, he carries the weight of decades spent wondering, searching, and ultimately accepting that he might never know what happened to his wife. Now, facing the moment he's both dreaded and longed for, his voice carries quiet strength. Aisha came to Mapleton because she believed in helping others, he tells the courtroom. She volunteered at the shelter because her faith taught her that service to humanity was service to God. She trusted the community to protect her as she tried to protect others. The prosecutor guides him through memories of their last conversations, the unsigned letters that frightened his wife, her growing unease about being watched. Did she ever mention Father Brooks specifically? She spoke of him respectfully, the way she spoke of all religious leaders. She appreciated his support for the shelter. She never suggested he made her uncomfortable. How do you feel, knowing that the man who led her memorial service was the one who killed her? Omar looks directly at the television cameras, broadcasting the hearing live. I feel grateful that truth finally found its way to light. Aisha always said that lies have weak foundations, but truth builds something permanent. Today, finally, we're building something permanent in her memory. The impact of his testimony extends far beyond the courtroom. Social media amplifies his words, creating a moment of national reflection about institutional trust and the cost of silence. Truth for Aisha trends on multiple platforms as people share their own stories of authority figures who escaped accountability. But the most powerful testimony comes from the witness, Aisha's friend from the hospital, who tried to reassure her that the anonymous letters were harmless. I told her not to worry, the witness says, her voice breaking. I said it was probably just someone with a crush. I never imagined. I carry that conversation with me every day. What if I had told her to call the police? What if I had taken it seriously? The prosecutor's response resonates beyond the courtroom walls. The failure to protect Aisha Rahman was not the failure of any individual to recognize danger. It was the failure of institutions to respond appropriately to repeated warnings. Your advice to a friend was reasonable given what you knew. The church's response to documented concerns was not. The distinction matters. Throughout Mapleton, people who have carried guilt for 25 years, neighbors who didn't report suspicious activity, friends who didn't push harder for answers, community members who accepted the official narrative begin to understand that individual actions exist within institutional contexts that either support or undermine personal responsibility. The church's official response comes in the form of a written statement read by the church representative during the hearing's final session. The words have been crafted by teams of lawyers and public relations specialists, but they carry the weight of institutional admission that will reshape how the diocese approaches accountability. The Archdiocese of Springfield acknowledges that our response to reports concerning Father Daniel Brooks between 1985 and 1989 failed to adequately protect members of our community. The statement begins, "We recognize that this failure contributed to circumstances that may have prevented the tragic death of Aisha Rahman." The careful language, "may have prevented," rather than would have. Prevented reflects legal necessity rather than moral conviction, but the admission itself represents an unprecedented acknowledgement of institutional responsibility. We apologize to the Rahman family, to the Mapleton community, and to all who were affected by our inadequate response to warning signs that demanded more thorough investigation. We commit to implementing policies that prioritize community safety over institutional reputation. The apology makes national news, analyzed by legal experts as either meaningful accountability or calculated damage control. But for those who lived through the original investigation, it represents something simpler. The first time anyone in authority has admitted that Aisha Rahman's death was preventable. The diocese announces concrete changes: mandatory reporting of all complaints involving clergy, independent investigation of allegations, transparency in disciplinary actions, and victim advocacy services. Critics argue these policies should have existed decades ago. Supporters see them as evidence that institutions can evolve, even slowly. Meanwhile, the memorial by Maple Creek undergoes transformation. What began as a small marker commemorating a missing woman evolves into something larger, a place where community members come to reflect on the difference between faith and blind trust, between institutional loyalty and moral courage. The stone inscription, carved at community expense, reads, Aisha Rahman, 1962-1989. Devoted to service, taken by betrayal, we belong to God, and to Him we return. The truth will set you free. Below the religious verses, a final line speaks to the broader lesson. In memory of all silenced by power disguised as virtue, the memorial dedication draws hundreds of people, Muslims and Christians, longtime residents and newcomers, those who knew Aisha and those who only learned her story through recent headlines. Rabbi David Goldman from the Springfield Interfaith Council delivers remarks that capture the day's complex emotion. We gather not to celebrate the end of a story, but to acknowledge that some stories never truly end. Aisha Rahman's death asks questions that each generation must answer anew. How do we balance respect for authority with protection of the vulnerable? How do we distinguish between faith that serves love and faith that serves power? The memorial service by Maple Creek takes place on a crisp autumn morning, exactly 25 years after Aisha Rahman first arrived in Mapleton. The timing is intentional, a deliberate juxtaposition of endings and beginnings that reflects the complex nature of resolution in cases where justice comes too late to save, but not too late to matter. Omar returns to Mapleton for the first time since leaving in 1989. He stands beside the memorial stone, holding a photograph of Aisha taken at the women's shelter, her face radiant with the joy of service, unaware that her dedication would lead to her death. She would have appreciated this, he tells the gathered crowd. Not the attention, but the commitment to truth. Aisha believed that lies create suffering and truth creates healing. Today we choose healing. The service includes readings from both the Quran and the Bible, the verses carved into the memorial stone that acknowledge both Aisha's faith and the Christian community that failed to protect her. But the most powerful moment comes when Sister Margaret, now 83 and using a walker, approaches the microphone. "I supervised Aisha's work at the shelter," she says, her voice carrying across the quiet crowd. "I introduced her to Father Brooks. I ignored warning signs that might have saved her life. For 25 years, I've carried the weight of that failure." She pauses, gathering strength for words she's rehearsed but never spoken aloud. "But today I want to speak not about my guilt, but about her goodness." Aisha Rahman came to our shelter and saw women others had abandoned. She sat with them through crisis, helped them find hope, treated them as if their lives mattered. That was her ministry. That was her gift to our community. Sister Margaret's voice grows stronger. "Father Brooks stole her life, but he could not steal her impact. Every woman helped at the shelter carries part of Aisha's compassion forward. Every act of interfaith cooperation honors her memory. Every time we choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, we continue her work." The applause that follows feels different from typical memorial services, not polite acknowledgement but genuine commitment. Many attendees approach Omar afterward, not offering empty condolences but making specific pledges: to volunteer at shelters, to speak up about suspicious behavior, to prioritize human safety over institutional reputation. The local newspaper runs a front-page editorial that captures the day's significance. Aisha Rahman's murder was a crime committed by one man, but her death was enabled by a community's choice to trust authority over evidence, reputation over safety. Today, we choose differently. Today we promise that her story will teach us to see clearly, speak honestly, and act courageously when faced with the choice between protecting power and protecting people. In the months following the memorial service, investigators released the complete contents of Father Brooks' journal. The public, the decision, controversial within law enforcement circles, reflects the district attorney's commitment to transparency and the community's right to understand how institutional failure enabled tragedy. The journal entries reveal not just obsession, but a disturbing theology that twisted religious concepts into justification for stalking and ultimately murder. Forensic psychologists analyzing the writings identify patterns consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, masked by religious authority. Brooks wrote about Aisha as if she were a spiritual test sent by God, explains the forensic psychiatrist interviewed by local media. He couldn't distinguish between his desires and divine will, between his fantasies and religious calling. This is particularly dangerous in individuals who hold positions of unquestioned moral authority. The journal's most disturbing entries describe Brooks' increasing conviction that he was destined to save Aisha from her Muslim faith through some form of conversion, voluntary or forced. His December 3rd entry suggests he approached her that night, planning to persuade her to leave her husband and convert to Christianity. "She will understand tonight that God has brought us together for His purpose." I will show her the light that has been calling to her through me. If she cannot see it willingly, perhaps the waters of baptism will open her eyes as they open mine. The psychological profile that emerges from these writings helps explain both the crime itself and the ritualistic arrangement of Aisha's body in Maple Creek. Brooks apparently believed he was performing a sacred act, baptizing her into his version of salvation even as he ended her life. This was not a crime of passion, but a crime of delusion, the forensic psychiatrist concludes. Brooks had convinced himself that murder was martyrdom, that killing was saving. This makes him particularly dangerous because his conscience was not deterred by moral boundaries, it was corrupted by them. The revelation sparks national conversation about the intersection of mental illness and religious authority. Seminary programs begin incorporating psychological screening into their admissions processes. Dioceses implement new protocols for monitoring clergy, mental health, and responding to reports of unusual behavior. But perhaps the most significant change occurs within Mapleton itself. The town establishes an annual Truth and Transparency Day on December 3rd, the anniversary of Aisha's death. Schools teach units on recognizing manipulation and speaking up about concerning authority figures. The Women's Shelter, now renamed the Rahman House, trains volunteers to identify predatory behavior disguised as religious interest. The transformation is not without resistance. Some longtime residents argue that the town has overcorrected, that suspicion has replaced appropriate respect for religious leaders. Others contend that 25 years of denial cannot be undone by a few months of awareness. The final legal chapter of Aisha Rahman's case closes with a decision that establishes precedent for future posthumous prosecutions. The judge's ruling, carefully crafted to balance legal principle with moral necessity, becomes a model for jurisdictions grappling with similar cases of delayed justice. While the death of the accused prevents traditional criminal prosecution, the judge writes in her formal opinion, the public interest in establishing truth and acknowledging institutional failure justifies these extraordinary proceedings. Future prosecutors facing similar circumstances may cite this case as precedent for posthumous charging when evidence clearly establishes guilt and when institutional accountability requires formal legal recognition. The ruling serves multiple purposes beyond Aisha's case. Across the country, prosecutors review cold cases involving deceased suspects where institutional protection may have prevented timely investigation. 3 similar cases are filed within 6 months, each citing the Rahman precedent. More importantly, the legal recognition of institutional failure creates liability that extends beyond criminal prosecution. Omar Rahman, represented by civil rights attorneys working pro bono, files a wrongful death lawsuit against the diocese. The case settles out of court for an undisclosed amount, with funds designated for victim advocacy programs and enhanced oversight of clergy behavior. But money cannot restore what was lost. Omar uses the settlement to establish the Aisha Rahman Foundation, which provides support for interfaith families and trains religious communities to recognize and respond to predatory behavior among clergy. Aisha always said that from great loss can come great purpose. Omar tells the foundation's board during their first meeting, I cannot bring her back, but I can try to prevent other families from losing what we lost. The foundation's icons work extends internationally, partnering with organizations in Muslim-majority countries where interfaith marriage creates vulnerability, and with Christian communities where religious authority sometimes shields abusive behavior. The foundation's motto, drawn from Aisha's own words recorded in her letters, becomes, service to humanity is service to God. Omar remarries in 2018 to a widow named Sarah, whose husband died of cancer 3 years earlier. Their wedding takes place at the memorial site by Maple Creek, with readings from both Islamic and Christian traditions. The ceremony acknowledges grief while celebrating hope, recognizing that healing does not require forgetting. Aisha would have liked Sarah, Omar tells reporters who cover the wedding. They both understood that love multiplies rather than divides, that helping others creates community rather than conflict. Today I marry not to replace what was lost, but to honor what was found. The final symbol comes in, the form of a small garden planted beside the memorial stone. Community volunteers tend vegetables that supply the Rahman House shelter, ensuring that Aisha's commitment to feeding others continues in perpetuity. On winter evenings, when snow covers Maple Creek and streetlights cast long shadows across the memorial stone, visitors still come to remember and reflect. Some leave flowers, roses for love, lilies for renewal, simple daisies for innocence lost. Others leave small stones, a Jewish tradition adopted by people of all faiths to mark remembrance that endures. But most come simply to read the words carved in granite and consider their meaning for their own lives. The memorial has become an unexpected pilgrimage site, drawing visitors from across the country who seek to understand how one woman's death sparked a community's moral awakening. A guest book, maintained by the Rahman House, records reflections that range from personal grief to political analysis to spiritual searching. My uncle was abused by a priest when he was 12. For 60 years, no one believed him. Thank you for believing, Aisha. I work at a women's shelter in Phoenix. Every day I think about how to protect the women we serve from the people who are supposed to protect them. I am Muslim. My daughter wants to volunteer at a Christian charity. I was afraid until I read Aisha's story. Now I understand that fear defeats the very purpose of faith. The entries reflect the complexity of Aisha's legacy, how her death became both warning and inspiration, cautionary tale and call to action. Detective, now retired and working as a private investigator, visits the memorial on each anniversary of the case's resolution. She brings with her the original case file, long since digitized and archived, but kept in physical form as reminder of how easily truth can be buried and how much work it takes to unearth it. I failed her the first time, the detective tells visitors who recognize her from news coverage. I accepted explanations that sounded reasonable, rather than following evidence that felt uncomfortable. The best I can do now is make sure other investigators learn from that failure. The detective volunteers her time training law enforcement personnel to recognize institutional bias and resist pressure to avoid investigating respected community figures. Her presentations include Aisha's case as example of how social status can blind investigators to obvious evidence. But perhaps the most significant ongoing memorial exists in the everyday choices made by people who learned Aisha's story and decided to live differently. The Mapleton school board member who insists on background checks for volunteer coaches. The parishioner who reports a priest's inappropriate comments to authorities rather than hoping they'll stop. The shelter worker who installs extra security cameras because protection matters more than trust. These individual acts of courage, invisible to media, and unmeasured by foundations, constitute Aisha Rahman's truest memorial, a community that chose to see clearly rather than look away. The confession room at St. Matthew's Church, where Father Brooks once heard the secrets of his parishioners, now stands empty most days. The new priest, Father Michael Santos, maintains the traditional sacrament but notices how few people seek the intimate spiritual guidance that once drew lines outside the confessional booth. Trust once broken takes generations to rebuild. Father Santos explains to visitors who ask about the changes in parish life since Brooks' crimes became public. People still come to worship, still participate in community service, but they approach pastoral authority differently now. Perhaps that's wisdom rather than loss. The church itself underwent renovation in 2020, funded partly by the diocese as gesture of renewal, and partly by community donations that reflected ongoing faith despite institutional failure. The most significant change was the removal of Brooks' memorial plaque from the sanctuary wall and the installation of a new stained glass window depicting various religious traditions united in service to others. But the most profound transformation occurs not in physical space, but in spiritual approach. St. Matthew's now partners regularly with the Islamic Center of Springfield, the Jewish Community Center, and other faith communities for service projects and educational programs. The interfaith cooperation that Brooks found threatening has become the congregation's defining characteristic. The lesson, taught in confirmation classes and adult education programs, focuses on distinguishing between faith in God and faith in human institutions. Young people learn to honor religious authority while maintaining healthy skepticism about human claims to divine sanction. Faith should make us more aware of human fallibility, not less. Father Santos teaches in his weekly adult education class. When someone claims to speak for God, our faith should make us listen carefully to what they're actually saying. The anniversary of Aisha's death has become a day of reflection throughout Mapleton's religious communities. Muslims, Christians, and Jews gather for joint prayer services that acknowledge shared commitment to justice and protection of the vulnerable. The services always conclude with the reading of Aisha's favorite verse from the Quran and Jesus' words about protecting the innocent. As evening falls over Maple Creek on this particular December 3rd, 26 years after Aisha Rahman disappeared, a small group gathers at the memorial stone. Omar and his wife Sarah have traveled from Chicago. The witness, now a grandmother, brings her teenage granddaughter to learn about speaking up when something feels wrong. Former detective places a new stone beside dozens of others left by previous visitors. The memorial site has evolved into something Aisha herself would have recognized, a place where people of different backgrounds come together to commit themselves to protecting others, to truth-telling, and to the courage required for both. The inscription on the stone catches the last light of winter sunset. "We belong to God, and to Him we return. The truth will set you free." Below those words, barely visible in the gathering darkness, the final line speaks to everyone who stops to read. "In memory of all silenced by power disguised as virtue." As the group disperses, each carrying Aisha's story back into their daily lives, Maple Creek flows quietly past the memorial stone. The waters that once concealed truth now reflect the lights of a community committed to never again choosing silence over safety, reputation over reality, or comfort over courage.